Max Verstappen is the 2024 F1 World Champion, his fourth world title, and no one could argue he isn't a worthy champion. Yes, the Red Bull was incredibly strong in the early part of the season, and Max won 7 out of the first 10 races, but the job was done by limiting the damage in the second half of the season, when Red Bull weren't as strong. You could say it was a season of two halves. Max didn't win for 10 races after Spain, which honestly no one saw coming. But let's start by looking at that dominant first half of the season. Max won comfortably in Bahrain, beating his teammate Sergio Perez by 22 seconds. He then took another win in Saudi Arabia, once again beating his teammate Perez, this time by 13 seconds. Australia is where we saw the first chink in the armour, with a presumed engine issue, which turned out to be a brake problem that caused a DNF. But by Japan, he was back to winning ways. Another 1-2 for Red Bull, Max beating Perez by 12 seconds. China was the first sprint race of the season, but Max took pole position, won the sprint, and easily won the race as well. Then Miami was the first non-DNF loss he endured, finishing behind Lando Norris in second place. McLaren, of course, with their big upgrade. Then as expected, he was back to winning ways in Imola, beating Norris once again. Although it wasn't easy, as Norris was chasing him down at the end of the race. Monaco, though, was a struggle. Max qualified 6th and ended up finishing the race in that same position, with Charles Leclerc winning his home race. But once again, Max bounced back in Canada, finishing ahead of Lando Norris for yet another win. He would finish ahead of Norris once more at Spain, but this was to be his last win for some time. But at this point, most of us already thought the championship was over. If we look at the point situation after the first 10 races, it told a pretty dominant story. If we compare Verstappen to Leclerc, Norris and Perez, this is how it looked. Max had 219 points in the first 10 races, from Bahrain through to Spain. Norris had 150 points, Charles Leclerc had 148, and Sergio Perez only had 111. That was a gap of 69 points to Norris. Nice. Then, Verstappen went through a period of 10 races without a win, but it was during that period that he actually made his championship by ensuring he maximised his points when his car wasn't the quickest. Look at the incredible damage limitation Max managed over the next 10 races. During those 10 races, so from Austria to Mexico, he scored 143 points, and his main rival, now Lando Norris, only closed the gap by 22 points, earning 165 points in total. Then Charles Leclerc made 143 points, and Sergio Perez only managed 39, his form massively dipping. Max then cemented his lead with a dominant win in Brazil from 17th, putting it realistically out of reach of Norris, but maximising his points during the period where the team was struggling was far more important. Everyone thought Max would take the title at Vegas, and he did. The simplest way for him to achieve that was to finish ahead of Lando Norris, and from lap 1, that never really seemed in doubt. He had a good start, stayed ahead of Norris, and worked his way up to second, which is where he ran for a long part of the race. Norris, on the other hand, he struggled to stay with Max. But then Max did struggle for pace in the last part of the race, and ended up falling behind Lewis Hamilton, Carlos Sainz, and Charles Leclerc. But it was a measured drive, and a mature one from Verstappen. He knew what he needed to do to confirm his title, and he didn't try to defend when he didn't need to. Yes, Max was aided somewhat by the lack of pace of McLaren, but let's be realistic here. Lando needed to win the race, and he was nowhere near doing that, and even if he did that, there was very little chance that he was going to be able to overcome that points deficit, really unless Max DNF'd the last 2 races. It would be naive though to not look at what his competitors could have done better, especially McLaren. We know that from around halfway through the season, McLaren have had a pretty competitive car, and in a lot of instances, the quickest car at a number of circuits. Despite winning at Miami and being second behind Verstappen at Imola, Norris then had a poor weekend in Monaco. He could, however, have won in Canada. He overtook Verstappen and Russell to lead the race in very tricky conditions, but ended up behind them after the pit stops. A safety car definitely didn't help him, but nor did the strategy calls. Spain, that was another misstep. Lando, who started on pole, ended up in 3rd place by the first corner, being overtaken by Verstappen and George Russell. Keeping positions on the first lap was something of a struggle for Norris all season. Even his own teammate was at it when we went to Monza, taking Lando by surprise into the second chicane. Lando, of course, went on to lose the Spanish Grand Prix, finishing a couple of seconds behind Max Verstappen. Lando then could and probably should have won in Austria, but a clash with Verstappen when he was chasing him down, and he actually dropped out of the race entirely, but Max was still able to finish in 5th. Lando also could have won in Silverstone as well. During that last stop, if he puts on the medium tyres, you have to assume he'd have had a brilliant chance of overtaking Lewis Hamilton and winning the race. Instead, he struggled with his soft tyres, fell behind Verstappen, but Hamilton won also on that same soft tyre as Lando, managing to make them last. I think that stretch between Imola and Silverstone was huge for the championship, and McLaren and specifically Lando will look back and realise they didn't capitalise. The other problem for McLaren, but a saviour for Red Bull, was the resurgence of Ferrari. Ferrari hadn't been anywhere really where they wanted to be in 2024, and despite Charles Leclerc winning at Monaco, his home race, they hadn't been challenging at the front consistently until later in the season. Charles Leclerc beat both the McLarens to the win in Monza, and then he also won in the United States, beating his teammate Carlos Sainz. Sainz himself then winning also in Mexico. McLaren could have done without that Ferrari resurgence. Max has also had to do this without his teammate backing him up. All the other teams have strong second drivers. After the first few races, it looked like Perez had turned a corner, pardon the pun, and was going to be the perfect wingman for Verstappen. But that early form didn't last. By China, Sergio Perez had had 6 podium finishes. A second in Bahrain, a second in Saudi Arabia, as well as another second in Japan and 2 podiums in China in the sprint and the feature race. He followed that up with another sprint podium at Miami. But he hasn't then had one since. We've just had the 22nd race of the season at Las Vegas, and he hasn't been on the podium since Miami. That tells you just how badly his performances have dipped, especially with the costly mistakes in the races and the lack of qualifying form, being knocked out in qualifying far too often. After the Las Vegas Grand Prix, Helmut Marko, who's been very critical of Sergio Perez in the past, wasn't holding back. We have to have 2 drivers who finish in the points, he said. Max is more than 200 points ahead of Sergio Perez. For now, the main thing was to win the championship for Max, but for our employees, it is a disappointment, because they will not receive their bonuses, as they depend on the position in the Constructors' Championship, and there's no chance we can win it. Helmut Marko not holding back any punches there, saying what we already know. Sergio Perez's performances have sadly meant that the team will lose out on the Constructors' title. Max has got to where he is this year without any support from his teammate. Congratulations to Max Verstappen on his 4th world title, and next year promises to be even closer. I'm looking forward to it.